Hello, and welcome back to the Okanagan Reader. I'm your host, Jim Bowering. In Chapter 26, everybody is speculating about the visitor. Work continues toward joining the comets. Elgin and Buzzard continue to get better at flashball. That's flashball. Say it again, flashball. Elgin and Frances move into their place, and they take some kids to the swimming hole. That sounds like fun. So here we go then.
Chapter 26 The Swimming Hole. The comet was buzzing the next day. Everyone was talking about the visitor, even as they began preparations for the joining. It was the first thing Elgin and Buzzard talked about when they got to the shop. Buzzard said he always knew it wasn't a natural phenomenon. When Elgin asked him how he knew, he said it was the most likely explanation. After seeing all the data, it was the only thing that made sense. "So," said Elgin, "what do you think they want?" Buzzard looked away. "Don't know what they want." He started shuffling the papers on his desk, not looking up. "Don't know." Something was worrying him about this. Elgin could see that, and it worried him, too. Buzzard was normally eager to talk about such things, to speculate on the unknown with insufficient data. Elgin was tempted to press him on it, to get him to explain, but he decided against it. He didn't want to prolong his friend's distress. He said, "It's going to be great to get to work on the joining, eh?" That brightened him right up, and he began chattering, a happy smile on his face. He was invigorated by the prospect of so much work, by the anticipation of so much data to comb through. His enthusiasm was infectious, and soon they were fully engaged, bouncing thoughts off each other and igniting an explosion of ideas. The first thing they realized was that they needed detailed knowledge of the composition of both comets, especially the sides that would meet. They went to Stanton. He agreed and arranged for a complete acoustical profiling, using sonar and seismic imaging. To begin with, they set up a more thorough analysis of the areas already done for the video, but the plan was to widen the area of interest until the facing hemispheres of both comets were completely mapped. It wasn't long before they had enough data to start putting the plan into action. The calculations showed, and were confirmed with each new iteration, that the comets would not be in danger, so they stopped planning to slow the contact speed to 0 and began aiming for 1 meter per second instead. That was the moment when it sank in for Elgin. Everything changed from theoretical to practical when they committed themselves to what some people had taken to calling a controlled collision. They soon settled into a routine of working by day and getting together during their off hours. Elgin and Buzzard had flashball practice twice a week, in addition to a couple of games. They both continued to improve, although Buzzard was beginning to level off. Elgin kept seeming to find new things to work on, while Buzzard continued to refine and perfect his specialty. Elgin and Fran were able to move into their place after a month or so. During construction, he'd got them a pair of vacuum suits and taken them outside the wall to observe. There wasn't much to see out there other than snow, but it was fascinating to view the process. First, they packed snow into the shape of the box they wanted to build. Then they formed the 2-meter thick outer shell in layers of water ice. Interior dividers were made much the same way. One interesting technique was in the ceiling and all the walls whose edges touched the square. They were made to allow light from the square into the interior of their rooms. The ceiling and most of the walls glowed. They also spent a lot of time in Stanton's bubble, which was usually crowded. There was something about the sense of exposure that made it seem more real than watching the little comet get closer on a screen inside. Now that the controlled collision had been affirmed, Frances had a lot of work to do too. It wasn't just a matter of lining up the comets and getting the speed right. There were also many things to do in the comet to prepare for the impact. When the comets made contact, they would experience changes to their velocities. Anything in their settlement that wasn't fixed was going to start moving relative to the comet. She had to make sure that there was nothing that was going to cause damage to the structure or danger to the inhabitants when that happened. One troublesome area was the water reclamation facility. The sewage treatment and water purification plants both had large quantities of liquid water. One effect of that was that they had to be kept warmer than other areas. Add high humidity to the high temperature, and this place was like the tropics of the comet. The problem was, all that water was going to slosh like crazy during the joining. They could plan to shut down the treatment part for a few hours. They could reduce the water content and seal the vessels for the duration, then start it up again afterward. The hard part was the purification system. It consisted of long tubes of water that supported a thriving ecosystem based on algae. The whole thing worked together, with dirty water going in one end and clean water coming out the other. They couldn't drain it without breaking its working cycle, which might take a long time to get restarted and stabilized again. Fran took Elgin there to have a look. The supervisor gave them a tour, explaining the function as they went. All the tubes were parallel and they were oriented very close to the main vector of the collision, so the surging water would be largely unimpeded. Elgin asked their guide one question. Can the ends be sealed? He got an affirmative answer, with tons of explanatory embellishment that he didn't hear. Eventually the supervisor realized that Elgin was no longer listening, and looked, somewhat miffed, at Frances for an explanation. "He's visualizing," she said, touching the man's arm and turning him away. "It's best to just pretend he's not here for a while," she said with a smile. He was somewhat mollified. When she said, "I think it's fascinating that these little creatures can do so much for us," he was completely won over. "They're plants," he said. "They represent one of the major evolutionary transitions in the planet's history." He earnestly explained everything in depth and detail. It was obvious that he didn't get the opportunity very often, with algae and sewage treatment not being highly interesting to most people. He was disappointed when Elgin rejoined them, but Frances made that all right too. "I think we can do it without disrupting your operation too much," Elgin said. "Since there won't be any inputs at the time, we can seal off both ends of each tube," he told them. "Then I think we should put some baffles in them, to dissipate the energy." He looked at the supervisor to see if that would be okay. Getting a nod, he finished up with, "We're going to have to buttress these stanchions, though. They're too light." The man thought about it, then said, "That should all be okay, as long as it doesn't interfere with its function." "That shouldn't be a problem," said Elgin. "You'll have to put up with people getting in your hair for a while, though." There were a surprising number of things like that, once you started to think about it. Everything that was loose had to be considered a potential projectile. They had everyone on the lookout for things that might be overlooked, and they set up a forum on the network where they could collect and discuss ideas. Fran also got the children involved. She began an initiative in the classrooms, a friendly competition to see who could identify the most potential problems and suggest the best solutions. Fran liked children, and she loved to do things with them. One day she said to Elgin, "I'm taking some kids swimming. Do you want to come?" Of course he wanted to come, but swimming? His mind was struggling with the concept of whether a swimming pool would work on microgravity. "Yes," she said, "at the reservoir." He had heard that there was a reservoir, and had put the information in the back of his mind. It was just a fact, and before now he hadn't thought about how it might be realized. "Yes," he said, "for sure. Let's go swimming." Now his brain was churning, trying to anticipate what it should look like. "Okay," she said. "We'll pick the kids up after lunch." "What do I need to take?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "No bathing suit required, obviously, and the water just runs off the sphere, so no towel either. You just give a little shake and you're dry." She gave a little shake to demonstrate, and he liked it so much that he asked her to do it again. With one thing and another, they passed the time before the outing quite pleasurably. They picked up the kids at school. The children were raring to go. They swarmed all over Frances, laughing and chattering and saying her name, and they gave Elgin a curious glance, too. Fran pointed at him and said, "This is Elgin. He's coming with us." Then she broke away to chat with the teacher, whom she seemed to know quite well. And Elgin smiled, realizing that she seemed to know many people well. That was her way. His adoring reverie was broken when he became aware of being in a crowd of children. They must have turned their attention to him when Fran left. He smiled and exchanged a few greetings, but couldn't think of anything to say. One little girl took care of that. "Are you with Frances?" she asked. "Yes," he said uncertainly. She considered that, looking into his face while the other children looked back and forth between them. He could tell he was being judged, and had no idea how he was doing. Finally she gave a little nod and said, "Okay," and the happy chattering started up again. Elgin was amused at how relieved he felt, and also left wondering how much of his acceptance was due to being with Fran. Then it occurred to him that he might have been judged on whether he was worthy of being with her. This was getting too complicated, so he concentrated on what the kids were saying. It was mostly a barrage of questions, and he tried hard to answer them. "We've been together for a few months." "I'm an engineer." "No, the square was built before my waking." "Yes, I worked on Stanton's ball." "Yes, I do play flashball." "Yes, Buzzard is a good friend of mine." "I like the way he plays too." Finally Fran came back, and Elgin's swarm disappeared. She got them moving and pointed in the right direction, then she fell in beside him. "How did it go?" she asked, with a grin. He laughed. "Fine, I think. It was a little scary there for a while, but I think I passed." She laughed too. "Kids can be pretty judgmental," she said, "but they're fair. And they really want to like you if you give them a chance." "That one little girl," he said, "she was something else." He looked at Fran. "You know," he mused, "she reminded me a bit of you." She was pleased, and he could tell she was blushing under her fur. "She's come up with some interesting ideas," she said. "She's the one who pointed out that people are loose and might be a problem during the joining." "Oh," he said, "and you've taken her under your wing." She liked that image. As they spread their wings and flew after a flock of excited children, she smiled at him, her face happy and relaxed. "Yes," she said, "under my wing." The school was just off the square on the orange side, and the swimming hole, as the kids were calling it, was out the red end, beyond Elgin's old rooms. They attracted a lot of attention on their way through the square. People looked up when they heard the commotion, and most of them grinned at the antics of the children. Plenty of them nodded or waved at Frances and Elgin. In the corridors, Elgin was worried that their energetic, haphazard progress might cause traffic problems. The knot of little flyers seemed to be moving along of its own accord, while its members concentrated on talking and playing. To Elgin's surprise, though, they were unconsciously keeping to their flying lane, even while seeming to pay no thought to it at all. It reminded him of the commuter he'd seen on his first day out with Stanton. They finally came to a narrow section of corridor. The width smoothly decreased until it was half of normal. They seemed to suddenly pick up a tailwind, and Elgin found himself automatically trying to slow down. No one else did, though. Fran sped ahead of him, seemingly unconcerned, and the kids were laughing and whooping as they were swept into a thickening fog. Of course. He made a few hard flaps and caught up with them before they disappeared in the mist. Here was a classic example of the Venturi effect. As the moving air, normally circulating so slowly that he didn't notice it, was forced through a narrowing channel, its speed had to increase. Higher speed creates lower air pressure, and that causes water vapor to precipitate out, hence the fog. Now he was working hard to keep at least one of his companions in sight. They were flying blind, but they seemed to know where they were going, and he didn't want to run into the walls at this speed. Finally they burst into a large gallery, and he fluttered to a stop in disappearing clouds of fog. The children were giddy with excitement, but Elgin's attention was focused on what looked like a small flashball court in the center of the cavernous space. But it wasn't a ball of ice. For one thing, the refractions were different, and for another, the surface was active with subtle wobbling. He was looking at a globule of water about 40 meters in diameter. "Wow," he said. Fran looked pleased with herself. "Isn't it nice?" "Yes," he said, sniffing the air. He took a great draught, and humid, too. "I knew you'd like it." "I do. I love it." A large cavern, about 3 times the diameter of the ball of water, filled with the happy echoes of children at play. Everything was water, from the spherical pool in the center to the far walls of ice. The space between was filled with so much water vapor that the least thing would provoke it to condense out. He could see tiny droplets forming on their fur. He saw jets of mist forming spontaneously. He thought they might be caused by bursts of air, assuming that's how the swimming pool was kept in position. He even thought he saw tiny tracks forming randomly, as in a cloud chamber. Cosmic rays? Probably. The children, who had exploded out and filled the gallery with their energy as soon as they blew through the door, were drifting in and gathering by the water. They mingled, waiting, throwing many glances at the adults. Frances flew over, counting them as she went. "Okay," she said, "you all know the rules." They nodded seriously. "Does everyone have a buddy?" She watched them pair off. "Good. You keep track of each other." More serious nods. "And remember," she began, "it's not fun." "Unless everyone's having fun," they finished. Fran was about to let them go in when he saw a contemplative look on the girl, Maria. "Maria," she said quietly. When the girl looked, she asked, "Is something bothering you?" "No," Maria said. "It's nothing. I was just thinking about the water." She glanced at its gently shaking surface a few meters away. "The water? What about it?" "Well," she said, "it's going to be loose too, at the joining, I mean." Everyone looked at it. Fran and Maria shared a glance, and both of them looked at Elgin. He said, "No one else has ever brought that up." Then he went quiet, and the kids looked at Frances. "It's okay," she said. "He's an engineer." The children nodded, understanding looks on their faces. "He's visualizing what will happen." She indicated the water. "You can go swimming now if you want. You can find out later." A few of them would have gone right then, but most of them made no move. When Maria indicated she was waiting, they all waited. It didn't take long. "No," said Elgin. "It won't hurt anything. We can just let it be." He looked at Maria and Fran. "But I do think we should set up a bunch of cameras in here." "Oh, yes," said Maria. "Can we?" She looked at Fran, who looked at Elgin. "Sure we can," he said. "No problem." Maria wanted to say something, but seemed reluctant. Fran encouraged her, and she finally said, "Could I do it? I mean, can I help with the cameras?" Her normal air of assurance had been replaced by uncertainty. "And the videos? Can I see the videos afterward?" With both of them looking at him, Elgin only had one option. "Of course you can, Maria," he said. "If you're interested in that kind of thing, then we certainly want to encourage it." He made eye contact with Fran and asked her a silent question. When she nodded, he added, "We can make it a school project if you like. Your whole class can help." She liked that, and so did the other kids, so they said they would firm it up with their teacher later. "So about a month before contact," he told Maria, "if you remember that long and still want to do it," there was a loud round of affirmation from them all, "then you get hold of Frances and we'll set it up." Everyone seemed satisfied, and their attention turned immediately back to the water. Fran clapped her hands. "All right," she said. "Does everyone still want to go swimming?" They did, and she said, "Go." They stood back and watched their charges dive in. One or two of them eased their way into the water, but most of them took a couple of flaps and plunged in head first, tucking their wings firmly onto their backs. Once the splashes had drifted away, they were able to see clearly into the water, though the now pitching surface continually broke up the images of the swimmers. Elgin could see that they didn't use their wings in there. He guessed that they were too lightly built and not stiff enough to be effective in water. Kids were popping their heads out of the water at random points on the sphere to catch a breath of air. Occasionally one would fully emerge, turn sharply with a quick flap, and plunge back in. A few of them were practicing diving. They would gather about 10 meters from the water and then, one by one, fly hard at it and dive in. Then Maria popped out a few meters to their right, sticking out of the sphere almost at right angles to them, her legs still under water. "Are you guys coming in?" she asked, shaking the water off her wings. Elgin was caught by the sight of her wings. Soaking wet, with the fur plastered to their skin, they became translucent. He could see the shadows of their bones, and their resemblance to big, long-fingered hands was striking. He knew the body was induced to grow modified hands for wings, but seeing it this plainly was far more effective than simple knowledge. "Yes, we're coming," said Fran, then tipping her head at Elgin. "It's his first time," she said, smiling. "Oh," said Maria, her face understanding. She was about to say more when someone grabbed her by the feet and pulled her back into the water. She only had time for a little squeak before snatching a quick breath. They could see her chasing someone toward the other side, their images bouncing and breaking up. "Come on," said Fran, and she glided head first through the surface. Elgin took it a little more slowly. First he got close and stuck his hand in to test the temperature. It seemed all right, so he took a breath and stuck his head in, which looked funny from both sides. Opening his eyes, he was now able to see everything distortion-free. The kids looked as if they were playing in the open air. They were flying or hovering just the same, only it was much slower, and instead of using their wings, they were using their arms and legs. And of course, they had to keep going to the surface for air. He spotted Maria, who was leading a small formation in some kind of synchronized exercise. They were forming patterns and making turns and looping through the surface to breathe, all in graceful unison. It was like synchronized swimming, but without the distraction of gravity. It looked effortless in its slow, stately beauty. He looked around for Fran and found her swimming just below the surface. She was doing the breaststroke, gliding serenely around the pool, popping her head out for a breath every few strokes. She looked as if she was doing laps, completely unconcerned about anything else, but Elgin could see that she was in a perfect position to watch the children. He yanked his head out and caught his breath, then he went in. It was a lot like floating in the air except for the heavy resistance and the fact that he couldn't breathe. Some of the kids saw him and came over to swim circles around him. He grinned back at them and headed for the other side. He underestimated how far 40 meters was underwater, and by the time he got there he was badly out of breath. He swam straight out of the water, fully emerging into the air, gasping hugely. The kids came out too, fluttering around him, quite concerned. When he noticed that, he hammed up his panting, and their worry dissipated into laughter. When he went back in, he decided to stay close to the surface. Deeper dives could wait for later, after he was more used to it. For now he emulated Frances, doing a slow breaststroke in an orbit approximately at right angles to hers. It didn't take long to see why she did it. In less than one circuit he had found the rhythm, and was able to keep it up almost automatically, freeing his attention for watching over the kids. That left most of his mind unoccupied. It occurred to him that he didn't experience any undue water pressure when he swam through the center of the pool. He was under as much as 20 meters of water, but he didn't feel so much as a twinge in his ears. It was logical, of course, that water held together by its own self-cohesion wouldn't act the same as water compressed by gravity. If he had thought about it, he certainly wouldn't have expected to find any significant pressure gradient, but he hadn't thought about it. He looked around to find Fran, and had to look back to see her because of where they were in their orbits. She had stopped swimming and was looking his way, and with good reason. He found that he was being followed by a line of children stretched out behind him, all doing the breaststroke in unison with him. He bobbed out for a breath, and so did they. He went back under, and so did they. He was looking back past his left shoulder, and so did they. He burst out laughing, and that's not something you can do in water, so he broke into the air, spluttering and coughing and laughing. So did they. Fran and the rest of the kids came over, and everyone was having a good laugh. She checked to see that he was all right with it, and saw that he was genuinely amused and not offended at all. She fell a little more in love. "Okay," she said. "Everybody back in the pool for one last swim, then we'll go." As they bolted, she added, "Be careful and watch your buddy." Those who looked back after diving in, and that was most of them, saw Frances hug Elgin and give him a big kiss.